Chapter 1 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dom Noah Moerbeek. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by John GAUME. Translated by a daughter of Saint Joseph. Dedication to the glorious Saint Joseph. O blessed Father Saint Joseph, guardian of the incarnate Word, spouse of the Immaculate Mother of God, and patron of the Universal Church, with sentiments of the deepest love and gratitude, I dedicate to thee this work, destined, I hope, to enkindle in many hearts devotion to the cross of Jesus, the shadow of which brooded so heavily, yet withal so gloriously, over thy life in Bethlehem, Egypt, and Nazareth. Deign, O holy patron, to accept and bless it, that through thy intercession it may become to many the channel of the graces promised herein. By the memory of the agony thou didst undergo during the 3 days' loss, I beseech thee to take pity on those myriads of souls who have wilfully lost their God, have separated themselves from him and his church, and rush blindly to destruction, ignorant or unmindful of their loss. Thou art, according to Saint Therese, the minister plenipotentiary, the treasurer general of the Most High. Open then those heavenly treasures, shed them on the children of the Church committed to thy care, and grant that by means of the sign of the cross we may pass through life untainted by the vice and infidelity of the world. Let us not glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, the instrument of our redemption, the pledge of our eternal salvation. The Translator. Feast of the Presentation of Our Lady, November 21st, 1872. Preface to the second edition. One word on the publication of this little work and the unexpected success it has obtained. How did the idea of this book occur to us? Who arranged the unforeseen circumstances to which it owes its origin? Why does a work, destined to reawaken the faith of the Catholic world in the sign of the cross, appear at this time, and not 2 or 3 centuries ago? Why is it that until now no pope thought of attaching a spiritual favor to that formula, the most venerable, most ancient, and most customary of our religion? How is it that amidst so many solicitudes, Pius IX has deigned to listen to our feeble voice, and hasten to admonish the Christians of our day to have recourse as frequently as possible to the sign of the cross, conformably to the example of their primitive ancestors? Why, in order to encourage them, has he enriched its use with an indulgence doubly precious? To all these questions we knew not, at first, what to reply, but now the light is made. All comes to the point in the Church, for divine providence never gropes in the dark, accustomed as it is to that which is not, to confound that which is. It shows itself no less admirable in small things than in great. The sign of the cross is, then, the arm of the power against the demon. Instructed by the apostles themselves, the early Christians knew it. In continual warfare with Satan, in all the power of his reign, and the cruelty of his rage, the regulator of morals, ideas, arts, theaters, festivals, and laws, the master of altars and thrones, sullying all and making of all an instrument of corruption, they had incessant recourse to this infallible means of dispelling the fascinating charm, and warding off the fiery darts of the enemy. Hence, the continual sign of the cross became for them an exorcism of every moment. If, then, there appears now, without any premeditated design on the part of the author, a work designed to make the Christians of our days retake the victorious weapon of their ancestors, if, notwithstanding so many adverse circumstances, this work spreads so rapidly, if it wins, even in Rome itself, the most august and precious of all suffrages, if, in fine, after 18 centuries, the Vicar of Jesus Christ, the chief of eternal combat, by a solemn act urges the Catholic world to have recourse incessantly to this sign, so victorious over paganism, is it not reasonable to conclude that we find ourselves in many respects in a position analogous to that of the primitive Christians? If they were confronted with Satan, the king and god of that age, if they lived in the midst of a world that was not Christian, that wished not to become such, that wished no one to be such, that persecuted those who continued to be such, are not we confronted with Satan, who, unchained on earth, is inciting nations to rebel against Jesus Christ, and making them cry out incessantly, "We will not have him reign any longer over us"? And amidst what do the Christians of our day live? Are they not surrounded by a world that is ceasing to be Christian, that does not wish to return to Christianity, that does not wish others to belong to it, that persecutes in every possible way those who persist in doing so? Cunning, violence, calumnies, injury, blasphemy, sarcasm, exploitation, exile, death itself, are not all employed against the children as they were against the fathers? Arts, theaters, books, feasts, laws, sciences, are they not now, as formerly, employed as weapons against Christianity? Is it, then, astonishing that the sentinel of Israel, the sovereign pontiff, has come, by an act unknown in his predecessors, to reawaken the faith of Christians by this sign, the protector of the Church and of society? The analogy is so striking that Protestants themselves are amazed at it. In their view, as in ours, there is no salvation for the present world but in the cross. In the beginning of an October Prussian journal, the Gazette of the Cross published a long article entitled, "By this sign thou shalt conquer, in hoc signo vinces." Today, said the Protestant writer, we are engaged in spiritual warfare, with the same anti-Christianism which Constantine of old vanquished with the material sword. Doubtless we should say again, "Thou shalt conquer by this sign, in hoc signo vinces." The hidden and cruel powers of darkness rise to assault that crown, by the grace of God, the key of the arch of the social Christian order. Must not then the evil and the remedy be equally incontestable, when we see those same Protestants who formerly repudiated the sign of the cross as an act of idolatry, proclaiming the necessity of having recourse to it in these days, as a weapon indispensable to us, if we wish to conquer the hidden and cruel powers whose triumph would be that of barbarism? The appearance in some manner providential of the sign of the cross in the 19th century alone explains the rapid success which it has obtained. The first French edition was sold in a few months. 3 translations of it have been made into different European languages, one in Rome, one in Turin, and one in Germany. Catholic papers have vied with one another in recommending its perusal, and many letters have been sent to us, bearing the congratulations of the most respectable men of France and foreign countries. Soli Deo honor et gloria. To God alone be honor and glory. All agree to show the fitness of our humble work, and to enhance the greatness of pontifical grace which is the eternal result of it. Let us quote only a few lines, begging those who wrote them to receive the expressions of our sincere gratitude. The learned Neapolitan review, Scienza Fede, concludes its long analysis by saying, "What profit will our society immersed in materialism exclaim? What profit can humanity draw from this new work of Monsignor Gaume? Will it give help to the poor laboring classes, whom the revolution has deprived of work? Will it enroll volunteers for Poland? Will it exterminate the brigandage which is desolating Italy? It will do more than all this. It will give the bread of faith to those in want of it. It will enroll the Christians of the 19th century under the standard of the cross, in the furious war which they have to sustain against this infernal brigand, under this divine standard which has saved the world, and which alone can again preserve it. Whatever the future may be, it will teach them how to be noble victors or noble victims. In hoc vinci." Overjoyed at seeing an indulgence attached to the sign of the cross, the venerable dean of the Catholic chair writes, an indulgence granted to the sign of the cross at your request. What will so many persons, whom I do not wish to name, say? The Holy Father has repaid with usury the pains you have taken in order to stop the paganism which invades us. By you and through you, the whole Church receives the signal favor of an indulgence, extensive as the universe and durable as ages, which shall fall at every hour, at every second, as a refreshing dew upon the souls in purgatory. How many blessings will those souls call down upon you? And if, at the time of your death, you be called on to pay them a short visit, what a reception will there await you! Let us pass to other testimonies, and come to those which have emanated from Rome. The commission charged with the care of the legionary schools has thought it necessary to address the following circular to those who direct them. Among many books, useless and dangerous, particularly for youth, there are not wanting some that are useful, and well calculated to spread in the souls of youth the beautiful maxims of our august religion, and the love of its holy practices. One of those works is unquestionably the lately published by Tiberine, entitled The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century, which has been highly eulogized by many Catholic journals. The undersigned, while strongly recommending teachers not to permit in their schools any work not approved by the Commission, equally recommends them to cause the aforesaid work to be bought and read by their pupils. They may also use it as a premium at the annual distributions which they are accustomed to have in their respective schools. Rome, from the office of the Secretary of the Commission, L. Pirano, Deputy. End of preface to the second edition. Letter of His Eminence Cardinal Altare, Prefect to the Sacred Congregation of the Index, to Monsignor Gaume, Prothonotary Apostolic. Rome, August 7th, 1863. Most illustrious Lord, by the publication of your admirable work, The Sign of the Cross, you have rendered a new and signal service to the cause of the Church of Jesus Christ. In effect, you have made known to the faithful in the most attractive manner all that is clearly contained, all that is taught, all that is operated in a most sublime manner of what is holy, divine, and consequently sovereignly useful to souls in this sacred formula, as ancient as the Church herself. The august chief of this same Church, the Vicar of Christ, the sovereign pontiff, could not but receive most joyfully a work so precious and useful to Christian people. Therefore, not only did he express his great satisfaction when I gave into his sacred hands the copy you hastened to offer him by my means, but he has, moreover, been pleased to grant with kindness the desire you expressed of seeing the practice of the sign of the cross enriched with an indulgence, thereby to incite them to make use of it for the defense of their souls without any human respect, and as frequently as possible. In the following brief, you will see how bountiful the Holy Father has shown himself by the concession of such a grace, and how much it will cause its value to be appreciated. It is highly important that this new favor of the supreme dispenser of heavenly treasures, granted for the advantage of the Church militant, be universally known, at the same time that your excellent book shall be more widely spread and better appreciated. In the Italian translation made of it by the incomparable Angel of Aquila will be found the brief, and it ought to be inserted in the new editions, which certainly cannot fail to succeed each other. In this manner shall be filled the void which you have signalized in the Raccolta delle Indulgenze. Thus your Excellency shall receive the worthy recompense, and certainly that most desired by your heart, in seeing the treasures of redemption open for the good of souls still living on earth, or already descended into purgatory, by the effects of the work you have composed, with a view to draw the attention of everyone to the first sign of the worship which all should render to the principal instrument of our redemption. Receive the expression of the sincere and high esteem with which I am, most illustrious Lord, your affectionate servants, El Cardinal Altere. Brief of His Holiness Pius IX, Pope, for eternal remembrance. Being fully certain that the salutary mystery of the redemption and the divine virtue are contained in the sign of the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, the faithful of the primitive Church made the most frequent use of this sign, as we learn from the most ancient and notable monuments. It was even by this sign that they began all their actions. Quote, "At all our steps, all our motions, our incomings and outgoings, lighting the lamps, sitting down to table, taking a seat, whatever we do, or whithersoever we go, we mark our foreheads with the sign of the cross," end quote, says Tertullian. Considering these things, we have judged proper to reawaken the piety of the faithful towards the salutary sign of our redemption, by opening the heavenly treasures, in order that, imitating the beautiful example of early Christians, they may not blush at making frequently, openly, and publicly the sign of the cross, which is the standard of the Christian militia. Therefore, confiding in the mercy of Almighty God, and in the authority of His blessed apostles Peter and Paul, we grant, in the accustomed manner of the Church, to all and every one of the faithful of both sexes, every time that, at least, contrite in heart, and adding the invocation of the Blessed Trinity, they make the sign of the cross, 50 days' indulgence for the penances which would have been imposed, or that should do for any reason whatever. We moreover grant mercifully in the Lord that these indulgences may be applied, in the way of suffrage, to the souls who have departed this life in the grace of God. Notwithstanding all things to the contrary, these presents shall be given in perpetuity. It is also our will that the same credit be given to any written or printed copy of these presents, signed by a public notary, having the seal of an ecclesiastical dignitary, as would be given to these presents themselves, if they were shown or exhibited. Also that a copy of these letters be taken to the office of the Secretary of the Sacred Congregation of Indulgences and Holy Relics, under pain of nullity, conformable to the decree of the said congregation, dated January 19th, 1756, approved by our predecessor of holy memory, Pope Benedict XIV, the 28th of the same month in the same year, given at Rome at St. Peter's under the Ring of the Fishermen, the 28th of July, 1863, the 18th of our pontificate. Cardinal Paracini Claleri. These present apostolic letters, in the form of a brief dated July 28, 1863, were presented at the office of the Secretary of the Sacred Congregation of Indulgences on the 4th of August of the same year, conformably to the decree of the same Sacred Congregation, under date of the 14th of April, 1856, in testimony of which given in Rome at the same office, the day and year, as mentioned above. Archbishop Prinzivali. End of the brief of His Holiness Pope Pius IX. Preface to the first edition. In the month of November of the great year 1862, a young German Catholic of great distinction arrived in Paris to pursue his course in the College of France, faithful, according to the traditional usage of his country, to make the sign of the cross before and after meals. He, on the first day, became the wonder of his school companions. The next day, in virtue of the freedom of worship, he was the object of their mockeries. In one of his visits, he begged us to tell him what we thought of the practice, of which his companions were trying to make him ashamed, and of the sign of the cross in general. The following letters are intended as an answer to those two questions. End of preface to the first edition. The sign of the cross in the 19th century. First letter. State of the question. The present world does not make the sign of the cross, or makes it seldom, or makes it badly. The primitive Christians made it. They made it frequently. They made it well. We are right, and they were wrong. Or, we are wrong, and they were right. Which is true? Paris, November 25th, 1862. My dear Frederick, scarcely 15 days have elapsed since the newspapers announced the shipwreck of Captain Walker. This account, which we read together, was so much more sorrowful as by it we learned the death of many of the passengers with whom we were acquainted. The vessel had struck upon a rock, the waves rushed in through the breach. Notwithstanding the efforts of the sailors, it was impossible to close it. In less than an hour the hold was flooded. The ship visibly sank below the waterline. In the hope of saving it, they began to throw all the merchandise into the sea. After the merchandise, the munitions of war, the furniture, and part of the rigging. Then followed the provisions, excepting 2 or 3 casks of water and a few bags of biscuits. All was useless. The vessels continued to sink, and its total wreck became imminent. As the last resource, Walker ordered the lifeboats to be lowered. Everyone rushed into them. Unfortunately, the greater number, instead of safety, found there a watery grave. With a few variations, this is, as you know, the history of every great shipwreck. The unfortunate men who, in such an extremity, command the vessel, are perfectly excusable in casting into the sea everything that they can make away with. Life before everything. The world of our day, the world which still calls itself Christians, and to which, no doubt, your young companions belong, presents more than one point of resemblance to a vessel damaged and about to perish. The furious tempests, which for a long time have incessantly beaten upon the vessel of the Church, have made large breaches in it, through which have entered many waves of anti-Christian doctrines, morals, customs, and tendencies. Woe, not to the vessel, which is imperishable, but to the passengers, who are not so. What has it done? I speak not of the world openly pagan. Its shipwreck is consummated. I speak of the world which still pretends to be Christian. What has it done? What does it continue to do every day with the munitions of war and the provisions of life, with the merchandise, furniture, and rigging with which the Church had supplied the vessel, that, notwithstanding the dangers of rocks and tempests, it might be assured of a successful voyage into the port of eternity? It has thrown them all, or nearly all, into the sea. Where are the prayers that were formerly said in common in families? In the sea. Pious reading and meditation? In the sea. The blessing at meals? In the sea. The habit of assisting daily at the holy sacrifice? The use of the scapular and the beads? In the sea. The serious sanctification of the Sunday, by assisting at all the offices and instructions, by visiting the poor, the sick, and the afflicted? In the sea. The regular reception of the holy sacraments, the obedience to the laws of fast and abstinence? In the sea. The spirit of simplicity, of mortification, of modesty in dress, amusement, furniture, food, and lodging? Where are the crucifix, holy images, holy water, and apartments? In the sea, all in the sea. And the vessel still continues to sink. The Christian spirit is diminishing. The contrary spirit is increasing. They cast themselves into skiffs, that is to say, into some kind of religion, which they make to suit their age, position, temperament, and taste, and they live in this way, assisting at a low mass on Sunday, and how? At high mass 3 or 4 times a year, at vespers never. Frequenting theaters and balls, reading everything that falls in their way, refusing themselves nothing but what they cannot get. Behold the frail skiffs to which they entrust their salvation. Can we be amazed at so many shipwrecks? Poor passengers, separated from the vessel, how much you are to be pitied! How much more to be pitied in the rising generation! Among the Catholic customs so imprudently abandoned by the present world is one, precious among all others, which I would wish, at every hazard, to save from shipwreck. It is that which your companions despise, without being aware of it. I mean the sign of the cross. It is time to provide for its preservation. Yet a little while, and it shall have met the fate of so many other traditional practices, which we owe to the maternal solicitude of the Church, and to the intelligent piety of Christian ages. Would you wish to know, dear Frederick, what is now the sign of the cross with those who pretended to be Christians? Place yourself on a Sunday at the door of a large church. Look at the crowd that enters the house of God. A great number advance haughtily or foolishly, it is all the same, into the holy place, without even casting a glance at the holy water font, and without making the sign of the cross. As great a number pretend to take or receive holy water and make the sign of the cross. You will see them dip their gloved hand into the holy water font, a thing as much against the liturgy as to go to confession or holy communion with gloves on. As to their manner of making the sign of the cross, it would be better to say nothing about it. It is capable of puzzling the most learned explainer of hieroglyphics. A motion of the hand, careless, hurried, mechanical, and imperfect, to which it is impossible to assign a form, or give it a signification, unless that the actors themselves do not attach the least importance to what they do. Behold their sign of the cross every Sunday. Among that crowd of Christians you will scarcely meet any who make this venerable sign of salvation carefully, correctly, and religiously. If, then, in a public place and under such solemn circumstances, the greater number of persons do not make the sign of the cross, or make it badly, I can scarcely persuade myself that they make it, and make it well, in other cases, where they are apparently fewer motives to do so. It is, then, an indisputable fact that the Christians of our day do not make the sign of the cross, or make it but seldom, and very carelessly. In this point, as in so many others, we are diametrically opposed to our ancestors, the Christians of the primitive church. They made the sign of the cross. They made it well. They made it very often. In the East as well as in the West, in Jerusalem, in Athens, and in Rome, the old and the young, the rich and the poor, priests and laymen, all classes of society, religiously observe this traditional custom. History affirms nothing more strongly. All the fathers of the Church who were eyewitnesses assert it. All historians prove it. Nothing would be easier than to cite their words. You will find them in the work De Cruce by your learned countryman Gretzer. In the name of all, hear the words of Tertullian. Quote, at every motion and every step, entering in or going out, when dressing, bathing, going to meals, lighting the lamps, sleeping or sitting, whatever we do or whither we go, we mark our foreheads with the sign of the cross. End quote. Footnote for sleeping, with hands crossed on the breast. End of footnote. From this we are to understand that at every moment our ancestors made the sign of the cross in one way or another, that they made it not only on the forehead, but also on the eyes, mouth, and breast. Hence it follows that if the first Christians were to reappear in our houses or public places and do today what they did 18 centuries ago, we should be tempted to regard them as lunatics. So true it is that in the use of the sign of the cross, we are directly opposed to them. They were wrong and we are right, or they were right and we are wrong. Either the one or the other. There is no medium. Which is true? Such is the question. It is grave, very grave, much more so than your companions and those like them think. I hope to convince you of this in my succeeding letters. End of the first letter. Chapter 2 of The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dom Noah Moerbeek. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by Jean GAUME. Translated by a daughter of Saint Joseph. Chapter 2. Second letter. Examination of the question. Prepossession in favor of the early Christians. First prepossession, their lights. Second, their sanctity. Third, the practice of true Christians in every age. Were the fathers of the Church great geniuses? November 27th. My dear friend, in ordinary cases, the exterior circumstances play an important part. They often have the value of direct testimonies in contributing to form the opinion of judges. You know that they thus examine the antecedents, position, and moral character of persons interested in the debate. Why should we pass them over in the case which occupies us? Therefore, before adducing the motives of the early Christians drawn from the very nature of the sign of the cross, let us examine together the prepossessions which militate in favor of their conduct. First prepossession in favor of the early Christians. They were contemporaries with the apostles. The apostles had conversed with the incarnate Word himself, the truth in person. They had seen him with their eyes and touched him with their hands. They were the depositaries and infallible organs of his doctrine. They had been commanded to teach it fully and entirely, nothing more, nothing less. In their turn, the primitive Christians had seen and heard the apostles and their disciples. From their lips they had received the faith, from their hands baptism. They had imbibed truth at its very fountain. With this truth, to which they owed everything, they nourished themselves. They made it the rule of all their actions, and preserved it with inviolable fidelity. Perseverantes in doctrina apostolorum. Evidently, none had better opportunities of knowing the thoughts of the apostles, and even our Savior himself. If the primitive Christians made the sign of the cross at every instant, we are forced to conclude that they obeyed an apostolic recommendation. Otherwise, the apostles and their immediate successors, the infallible guardians of the triple deposit of faith, morals, and discipline, would have speedily interdicted a useless and superstitious custom, so well calculated to expose the neophytes to the mockery of the ignorant pagans. Therefore, I repeat it, in making so frequently the sign of the cross, the Christians of the primitive church acted on very good reasons. This is the first preposition in favor of their conduct. Second preposition in favor of the primitive Christians, their sanctity. Not only were they well instructed in the doctrine of the apostles, but they were, moreover, most faithful to put it in practice. The proof of this is that they were very holy. Nothing is more clearly established than that a high degree of sanctity was the general character of the first Christians. First, they preferred to lose everything, their property and life itself, in the midst of tortures, rather than offend God. Their heroism lasted as long as the persecutions, that is, for 3 centuries. Secondly, they were very charitable. Heaven and earth have united in eulogizing their mutual love, unparalleled in the annals of the world. They had but one heart and one soul. Cor unum et anima una. Has God himself said, "Behold, how they love one another, and how ready they are to die for one another." Vide ut in vitium se diligant et ut pro altiutro mori sint parati, exclaimed the pagans. Thirdly, they were filled with respectful love for the apostles, whom they obeyed with filial submission. St. Paul, who paid no compliments, writes to the Christians of Rome that their faith is celebrated throughout the entire world, and to those of Asia that they loved him so much that had it been possible they would have plucked out their eyes to give them to him. At his request, all the churches fly to the help of the brethren of Jerusalem, and Philemon receives Onesimus. Fourthly, the fathers of the church, who were eye-witnesses, have continually rendered the most brilliant testimony to their sanctity. Addressing himself to the judges, praetors, and proconsuls of the empire, Tertullian gave them this solemn challenge, quote, "I appeal to your law processes, magistrates charged with the administration of justice. Among the multitudes of accused who are daily arraigned at the bar of your tribunals, Is there a prisoner, an assassin, a profaner, a corrupter, or a thief who is a Christian? It is your people who fill your prisons. It is yours that fill the mines. It is yours that fatten the beasts of the amphitheater. It is yours who form the troops of gladiators. Among them there is not one Christian, unless he be there for the sole crime of Christianity. Fifthly, the pagan historians recognized their innocence, and their very persecutors rendered homage to their virtue. Tacitus, the author far too exacting and unjust with regard to our fathers, relates the frightful butchery of the Christians under Nero. An immense multitude, says he, multitudo ingens, perished amid the most frightful torments. They were innocent of that with which they were charged, but they were worthy of the hatred of mankind. Odio generis humani. Behold the word. What was this mankind of Tacitus? He himself tells us, it was living filth, living cruelty. What caused this hatred? Because evil is the irreconcilable enemy of good. The sanctity of our fathers was the relentless condemnation of the monstrous crimes with which the pagans sullied themselves. Thence came Nero's butchers and his living torches. 40 years after Nero, Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, is charged by Trajan to inform against the Christians. Zealous courtier, he rigorously executes his master's orders, and causes our ancestors to be sought after. When put to the torture, he himself interrogates them. What is the result of his bloody proceedings? Quote, all the crime of the Christians, writes he to Trajan, consists in assembling together on a certain day before dawn, in order to sing the praises of Christ as of a God, in binding themselves by oath not to commit any crime, but to fly theft, robbery, adultery, and perjury. I have caused them to be put to the torture, and have found them guilty of nothing but an evil and excessive superstition. I have been expatiating, my dear Frederick, on the sanctity of our ancestors. In my mind, it forms the most powerful prepossession in favor of the sign of the cross. When men of this character, living in the face of death, show themselves invariably faithful to a usage, it must be that that usage is a little more important than your new companions believe. Third prepossession in favor of the primitive Christians, the practice of true Christians in the following centuries. At a very early period there began to be formed, both in the East and in the West, religious communities of men and of women. It is in those asylums, separated from the world, that we find the true spirit of the gospel and the pure tradition of apostolic teachings, if not permanent, at least perpetuated with the greatest fidelity. The sign of the cross figures among the number of ancient customs preserved with jealous care. Our fathers, the ancient monks, writes one of their historians, practiced the sign of the cross most frequently and religiously. They made it principally at rising, retiring to bed, before their work, in coming out of their cells and the monastery, or returning to it. They made it at table, over the bread, the wine, and every dish. In the world, in like manner, we find the traditional usage of this saving sign. All those great men who, during more than 500 years, succeeded one another in the East and in the West, those incomparable geniuses whom we call the Fathers of the Church, Tertullian, Cyprian, Athanasius, Gregory, Basil, Augustine, Chrysostom, Jerome, Ambrose, and so many others, who swell the list so terrible to pride, which it crushes by its weight, all those great intelligences practiced the sign of the cross most assiduously, and they incessantly recommended all Christians to make it on every occasion. I have called the fathers of the Church great geniuses and great men. If, as such, you compare them to your companions, expect a smile of pity. Be not angry with them, poor young men. They know the fathers of the Church as they know their antipodes. In your turn, ask them what they understand by great men. In default of their reply, here is mine. It may be useful to you. I call great men those who, by the elevation, depth, and extent of their genius, embrace the immense horizons of the world of truth, who know sciences, men and things, not on the surface, but in their principles, end, and intimate nature, not only the matters below, but the spirit above, not only the man, but the angel, not only the creature, but the Creator, not only what is on this side of the grave, but what is beyond it, not one detail, but the whole, not one isolated law of creation, but the whole system, from which they cause to spring unexpectedly luminous applications for the perfection of humanity. Behold genius, and behold the fathers of the Church. You can challenge your companions to find among the ancients or modern any who have verified better, or as well, the definition of a great man. However renowned they may be in particular departments, in chemistry, physic, mechanics, or art, they are neither geniuses nor great geniuses. The man whose ideas embrace only one law, secondary to universal harmony, deserves not the name of genius. No one calls great the musician who can draw but one sound from his instrument, but only him who strikes harmoniously every chord. Time does not permit me to finish my letter tonight. I will resume it tomorrow. End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by GAUME. Letter 3. Continuation of the third prepossession. The doctors of the East and the West, Constantine, Theodosius, Charlemagne, Saint Louis, Bayard, Don John of Austria, Sobieski. Fourth prepossession. The conduct of the Church. Fifth. Those who do not make the sign of the cross. Summary. November 28th. Now then, my dear friend, all those great geniuses, without exception, made the sign of the cross like little children. They made it frequently, and unceasingly recommended Christians to make use of it on every occasion. To make the sign of the cross, says one of them, over those who place their hope in Jesus Christ, is the first and best known thing amongst us, primum est et notissimum. Another, the cross is found everywhere, with princes and their subjects, with men and women, with slaves and freedmen, and all mark it on the most noble part of the body, the forehead. Never cross the threshold of your houses without saying, I renounce Satan and devote myself to Jesus Christ, accompanying these words with the sign of the cross. Cum hoc verbum et crucem in fronte imprimus. Another says, we should make the sign of the cross at each action of the day. Omne Dei opus in signo facere salvatoris. Others again, let the sign of the cross be continually made on the heart, on the mouth, on the forehead, at table, at the bath, in bed, coming in and going out, in joy and sadness, sitting, standing, speaking, walking, in short, in all our actions, verbum dicam in omni negotio. Let us make it on our breasts and all our members, that we may be entirely covered with this invincible armor of Christians. Armemur haec in superbabili Christianora armatura. Even to their last sigh, confirming their words by their example, we see those great geniuses die, like the illustrious Chrysostom, the king of eloquence, in making the sign of the cross. Formed in their school, the noblest Christians follow their footsteps. Speaking of St. Paula, the granddaughter of Scipios, St. Jerome says, "When she was at the point of death, and we could with difficulty hear her speak, she placed her thumb on her mouth, and faithful to usage, imprinted the sign of the cross upon her lips." Let us go back some centuries and point out some brilliant links in the traditional chain. Without speaking of those immortal emperors, legislators, and warriors, Constantine, Theodosius, and Charlemagne, so faithful to the use of the sign of the cross, let us come to the greatest of our kings, Saint Louis. His friend and historian, the Sire de Joinville, has left us the following testimony. At table, in the council, in the combat, and in every action, the king always began by the sign of the cross. Bayard the knight, without fear and without reproach, is mortally wounded. Worthy of his life, his last act is the sign of the cross, which he makes with his sword. Represented by two fleets of more than 400 ships, the Catholic and Mussulman powers meet each other in the Gulf of Lepanto. On the combat depends the safety of civilization or the triumph of barbarism. The destinies of Europe are in the hands of Don John of Austria. Before giving the signal for attack, the Christian hero makes the sign of the cross. All the commanders repeat it, and Islamism suffers a defeat from which it never recovers. Nevertheless, a century later, it tries to repair its defeat. Its innumerable hordes advance even to the walls of Vienna. Sobieski is called. Compared with those of the enemy, his forces are nothing. But Sobieski is a Christian. Before descending into the plain, he makes the sign of the cross on his army. He himself forms a living sign, by hearing Mass with his arms extended in the form of the cross. It was there, says a Christian warrior, that the Grand Vizier was overcome. I should never conclude, my dear friend, were I to cite, one after the other, all the facts which prove the perpetuity and frequent use of the sign of the cross among the true Christians of every age and condition, in the world as in the cloister, in the East as in the West. Does not this glorious tradition form a passably respectable proof in favor of our ancestors of the primitive Church? What do your young companions think of it? Fourth prepossession in favor of the primitive Christians: the usage of the Church. Ages roll by, and with the times men change. Laws, customs, fashions, language, manners of seeing and judging, all are modified. The Church alone changes not. Immutable as truth, of which she is the mistress, that which she taught, that which she did yesterday she teaches, she does today. She will teach, she will do tomorrow and always. What are her thoughts? What is her conduct with regard to the sign of the cross? There is no point on which her divine immutability is more clearly manifested. For 18 centuries we may say the Church has lived on the sign of the cross. She has not, for a single instant, ceased to employ it. She commences, continues, finishes everything by this sign. Among all her practices, the sign of the cross is the principal, the most ordinary, the most familiar. It is the soul of her exorcisms, prayers, and benedictions. What we see her do in our sight, in our basilicas, she did in that of our fathers in the catacombs. Without the sign of the cross, say they, nothing is done validly, nothing is perfect, nothing is holy. The power of the Church, like that of her divine founder, is exercised on creatures and on man. It extends to heaven and earth. Data est mihi omnis potestas in caeli et in terra. How does she exercise it? By the sign of the cross. All that she destines for her use, water, salt, bread, wine, fire, stone, wood, oil, balm, linen, silk, brazen figures, precious metals, all that belongs to her children, their dwellings, fields, flocks, implements of labor, the inventions of their industry, she takes possession of all by the sign of the cross. If she wishes to prepare an earthly dwelling for the God of heaven, first of all, the sign of the cross must consecrate the site of the edifice. Let no one, says the councils, dare to build a church without calling the bishop to the place, that he may make the sign of the cross, there in order to chase away the demons. The sign of the cross is the first thing she employs to bless the materials of the temple. She traces it 20 times upon the pavement, on the pillars, on the altar. To render it permanent, she makes it of iron, and places it on the summit of the edifice. When her children come into the house of God, what do they do before crossing the threshold? They make the sign of the cross. By what do the chiefs of prayer, the bishops and priests, begin to celebrate the praises of the Most High? By the sign of the cross. When at the beginning of the office we make the sign of the cross, saying the words, "O God, come to my aid," it is as if we would say, writes an ancient liturgist, "Thy cross, O Lord, is our help. The hand makes to thee the sign of it, and the tongue prays to thee in it. The demon is the chief of the enemies of our salvation. He governs the world. He flatters the flesh in order to allure us. If then, O Lord, thou wilt aid us by thy cross, he and all our enemies shall be put to flight." See principally the conduct of the Church towards man, the living temple of the Blessed Trinity. The first thing she makes over him after his birth is the sign of the cross. The last, when he returns to the bosom of the earth, is again the sign of the cross. Behold her first greeting and her last farewell to the child of her tender affection. Within the time that intervenes between the cradle and the grave, how many times is the sign of the cross made on man? At his baptism, in which he is made the child of God, the sign of the cross. At his confirmation, in which he becomes the soldier of virtue, the sign of the cross. In the Holy Eucharist, in which he is fed with the bread of angels, the sign of the cross. In extreme unction, in which he is strengthened for the last combat, the sign of the cross. In holy orders and matrimony, in which he is associated to the paternity of God himself, the sign of the cross. Always and everywhere, now as in former times, in the east as in the west, the sign of the cross is made on man. All this is yet nothing. Behold what the Church does, when, in the person of the priest, she ascends the altar. Armed with the omnipotence which has been given her, she comes to command, no longer a creature, but the Creator, no longer a man, but God. At her voice the heavens are opened, the Word again becomes incarnate, and renews all the mysteries of his life, death, and resurrection. Is there an act which ought to be performed with more solemn gravity? An act from which should be more carefully banished everything that might be foreign or superfluous? Now, in the course of this, the action by excellence, the Church, more than ever, multiplies the sign of the cross. She clothes herself with the sign of the cross. She goes through it with the sign of the cross. She repeats it so frequently that the number of times would seem to be exaggerated were it not so profoundly mysterious. Do you know how many times the priest makes the sign of the cross during Mass? He makes it 48 times. I am wrong. Throughout the whole of the august sacrifice, the priest is himself a living sign of the cross. And the Catholic Church, the grave teacher of nations, the great mistress of truth, does she amuse herself by repeating so frequently in her most solemn act a sign useless, superstitious, or of minor importance? If your companions believe this, they are wrong to call themselves unbelievers. It is not credulity that is wanting to them. The conduct of the Church and of true Christians in every age is, then, a victorious prepossession in favor of our primitive ancestors. Fifth prepossession in favor of the early Christians: those who do not make the sign of the cross. There are on earth 6 classes of beings that do not make the sign of the cross. First, pagans, the Chinese, Hindus, Tibetans, Hottentots, and the savages of Oceanica, adorers of monstrous idols, nations most deeply degraded, yet not the less unhappy. They do not make the sign of the cross. Secondly, Mahometans, swine by sensuality, tigers by cruelty, automata by fatalism. They do not make the sign of the cross. Third, the Jews, deeply encrusted with the thick layer of superstition, the living petrifaction of a fallen race. They do not make the sign of the cross. Fourth, heretics, impertinent sectaries, who have pretended to reform the work of God, who, in punishment of their pride, have lost even the last remnant of truth. I affirm, said one of your Prussian ministers lately, that I could write on my thumb nail all that remains among Protestants of common belief. Protestants do not make the sign of the cross. Fifth, bad Catholics, renegades to their baptism, slaves of human respect, haughty in their ignorance, who speak of everything, yet know nothing, adorers of the god of their belly, of the god of the flesh, of the god of matter, whose private life is like a sullied garment, they do not make the sign of the cross. Sixth, beasts, bipeds and quadrupeds of all kinds, dogs, cats, asses, mules, camels, owls, crocodiles, oysters, hippopotamuses, they do not make the sign of the cross. Such are the 6 classes of beings that do not make the sign of the cross. If, before tribunals, the moral character of the plaintiffs or defendants contributes powerfully to form the opinions of the judges, even before the examination of the cause, I leave you to judge whether the character of the beings who do not make the sign of the cross is a small prepossession in favor of the early Christians. In a word, with regard to the frequent use of the sign of the cross, the world is divided into 2 opposite parties. For it, the admirable Christians of the primitive church, the holiest and greatest geniuses of the East and the West, the true Christians of every age, the church herself, the mistress of truth. Against it, pagans, Mohammedans, Jews, heretics, bad Catholics, and beasts. It seems to me that you can already decide. Moreover, your conviction shall be more strongly confirmed when you learn the motives which justify the one and condemn the other. I will reveal them in the following letters. End of letter 3. Chapter 4 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by GAUME. Letter 4. Answer to one objection: the times are changed. Reasons in favor of the primitive Christians, drawn from the very nature of the sign of the cross. The sign of the cross is 5 things. A divine sign which ennobles man, proofs that it is divine. November 29th. As for me, I hear you say, my dear Frederick, the question is decided. Never will I believe that God has given truth and good sense to his enemies, and at the same time condemned his best friends to error and superstition. This avowal rejoices, yet does not surprise me. Your mind seeks the truth, and your heart does not reject it. If all were in the like dispositions, the apologist's task would be easy. Unfortunately, it is otherwise. In the greater part of controversies, particularly religious controversies, men argue not according to reason, but according to their passions. They combat, not for truth, but for victory. Sad victory, which more strongly confirms them in the slavery of error and vice. What I know of your companions, and so many other pretended Catholics of our day, gives me reason to fear they are ambitious for this fatal victory alone. I love them too much not to contest it with them. In order to remove the bandage with which they cover their eyes, as well as to strengthen yet more their own convictions, I shall expose the intrinsic reasons which justify the inviolable fidelity of true Christians to the frequent use of the sign of the cross. Let us first do justice to the great object of modern contemners of the adorable sign. Other times, other manners, say they. What was useful, nay, even necessary in the first ages of the Church, is not so now. Times are changed. We must live according to the manners of the day. St. Paul answers them, Jesus Christ yesterday and today and the same forever. Tertullian adds, the incarnate Word calls himself truth and not custom. Truth, then, changes not. What the apostles, the Christians of the primitive church, and the true Christians of every age have held to be useful and to a certain extent even necessary, has not now ceased to be so. I dare even to affirm it to be more necessary now than ever. This is on account of the many points of resemblance which exist between the situation of the primitive Christians and that of the Christians of the 19th century. What was the situation of our forefathers of the primitive church? They were in the midst of a world which was not Christian, which did not wish to become so, and which persecuted those who persisted in being so. And are not we in the midst of a world that is losing Christianity, that does not wish to return to it, and that persecutes, sometimes by violence, those who persist in professing it? If, in a like situation, the first Christians, formed in the school of the apostles, regarded as necessary the frequent use of the sign of the cross, why should we abandon it? Are we stronger or more skillful? Are our dangers less great, our enemies less numerous or perfidious? To propose such questions is to decide them. Let us proceed. Until now, my dear Frederick, I have established only the exterior circumstances of the cause. It is necessary now to examine it in its depth, by adducing reasons drawn from the very nature of the sign of the cross. For you, for me, for all sensible men, they may be summed up as follows. We are children of the dust. The sign of the cross is a divine sign, which ennobles us. We are ignorant. It is a book which instructs us. Poor, it is a treasure which enriches us. Soldiers, it is a weapon which puts the enemy to flight. Travelers on the way to heaven, it is a guide that conducts us. Assume the insignia of a judge, ascend your tribunal, and hear the cause. We are children of the dust. The sign of the cross is a divine sign, which ennobles us. Tell me who is that being that comes into the world weeping, who crawls like the worm, who, like the smallest animal, is subject to every infirmity, and for even a longer time than it, is incapable of supplying his own wants? Let the man who is called prince, king, or emperor, the woman who is called countess, duchess, or empress, be not too proud. One glance backward will tell them who that being is. It is man, a worm of the earth in the cradle, the food of worms in the tomb. That being so low, so useless, and during the first stages of his existence, so ignominiously confounded with the weakest and vilest of creatures, is, moreover, but too much inclined by his instincts to resemble them. Nevertheless, that being is the image of God, the King of creation. He must not degrade himself. God touches him on the forehead, and imprints a divine sign which ennobles him. Nobility imposes obligations. Respected by others, he will respect himself. This patent of nobility, this divine mark, is the sign of the cross. It is divine, since it comes from heaven, since the owner alone has the right to stamp his property with his image. It comes from heaven, since earth avows that it did not invent it. Go through every country and every age. Nowhere will you find the man that invented it, the saint that taught it, the council that imposed it. Tradition teaches it, says Tertullian. Custom confirms it. Faith practices it. In Tertullian you hear the latter part of the 2nd century of the Church. Saint Justin speaks for the first, and teaches not only the existence of the sign of the cross, but the manner in which it was made. Behold us in those primitive times, days of eternal memory, called even by the heretics the golden age of Christianity, on account of the purity of its doctrine and the sanctity of its morals. Here, then, we find the sign of the cross in full practice, in the East and the West. Let us go back a few steps, and we shall clasp hands with St. John, the last survivor of the apostles. See the venerable old man making the sign of the cross over the poisoned cup, and drinking the deadly liquor with impunity. A few steps farther, and we meet his illustrious colleagues, Peter and Paul. Like John, the beloved disciple of the divine Master, Peter and Paul, the princes of the apostles, make religiously the sign of the cross, and teach it from the east to the west, in Jerusalem, Antioch, Athens, and Rome, to Greeks and barbarians. Let us listen to an unexceptionable witness of tradition. Paul, says St. Augustine, carries everywhere the royal standard of the cross. He fishes for men, and Peter marks the nations with the sign of the cross. They make it not only over men, but also over inanimate creatures, and cause others to do the same. Every creature of God is good, writes the great apostle, and nothing to be rejected that is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. Such is the rule. What is the sense? In the study of law, if we meet with an obscure passage, what do? We elucidate it. We consult the interpreter best authorized and nearest to the legislator. His word is law. Listen to the best authorized interpreter of St. Paul, the great Chrysostom. Paul, says he, here establishes two things. The first, that no creature is unclean. The second, that supposing it to be so, the means of cleansing it is at hand. Make the sign of the cross over it, render thanks and glory to God, and at the same instant all uncleanness shall disappear. Behold apostolic teaching. The princes of the apostles make the sign of the cross not only over inanimate creatures and the multitudes who receive the faith from them, but on themselves also. This sign, then, existed before them. Paul the persecutor is thrown down on the road to Damascus. He must become the apostle of the God whom he pursues. What will be the first act of that victorious God? To mark the vanquished with the sign of the cross. Go, says he to Ananias, go and mark him with my sign. Who then is the author and institutor of the sign of the cross? To find him we must go beyond all ages, all visible creatures, all angelic hierarchies. We must rise to the eternal Word, the truth in person. Listen again to a witness who is so situated as to know it perfectly, a witness so irreproachable that he has sealed his testimony with his blood. I mean Saint Cyprian, the immortal bishop of Carthage. O Lord, holy priest, exclaims he, thou hast bequeathed to us three imperishable things, the chalice of thy blood, the sign of the cross, and the example of thy sufferings. Saint Augustine adds, it is thou that hast willed this sign should be imprinted on our foreheads. It would be easy to cite 20 other witnesses, but as I am writing letters and not books, I will stop. The sign of the cross is a divine sign. This is the first fact established in the discussion. There is another, of which I shall speak tomorrow. End of letter 4. Chapter 5 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by Jean GAUME. Letter 5. The sign of the cross ennobles us. It is the exclusive sign of the elite of humanity. It is the escutcheon of Catholicity. What a Catholic is. By ennobling us, the sign of the cross teaches us the respect due to ourselves. Importance of this lesson. Disgrace of those who do not make this sign. Picture of the contempt they have for themselves. November 30th. I have added, my dear Frederick, that the sign of the cross is a sign which ennobles us. It ennobles us because it is divine. All that is divine is ennobling. This reason alone might dispense with every other. Nevertheless, I add that it ennobles us, because it is the exclusive sign of the elite of humanity. Have your companions ever reflected on this? All who do not make the sign of the cross, and much more, all who are so unfortunate as to blush at it, remain confounded with pagans, Mahometans, Jews, heretics, bad Catholics, and beasts. That is to say, with the very dregs of creation. What do you think of this? Have we not reason to be proud of that which distinguishes us from those who do not bear it? A child is proud of belonging to a family venerable for its antiquity, illustrious for its services, respected for its virtue, powerful by its riches. Again, how jealous is he of his escutcheon! He carves it in stone, marble, silver, gold, agate, or ruby. He engraves it on his dwelling, sculptures it on his furniture, enchases it on his plate, and marks it on his linen. he bears it on his seal, would wish to carry it on his forehead. It is painted on the panels of his carriage, and even the harness of his horses is decorated with it. Leaving vanity aside, he is right. His conduct proclaims the eminently social law of solidarity. The glory of their forefathers is the glory of the children. It is the family patrimony. Being a Catholic, the sign of the cross is my escutcheon. It proclaims to me and to everyone the nobility of my race, its antiquity, its services, its glories, and its virtues. And I not be proud of it? I should then deny the illustrious blood that courses through my veins. Unworthy to bear a great name, I should basely repudiate the law of solidarity, throw my coat of arms into the mire, and cast to the winds the rich inheritance of my ancestors. Men are proud of belonging to an aristocratic nation. The Spaniard is proud of being Spanish, the Englishman of being English, the Frenchman of being French, and so with other great nations. Tell me, my friend, which is the grandest, the most aristocratic nation on the globe? It is a nation more ancient, and which in itself alone has a greater number of citizens than all those I have named, a nation which by its light shines in the world like the sun in the firmament, a nation essentially expansive, which, at the price of its blood, has drawn the human race out of barbarism, and, at the same price, prevents it from falling back into it again, as is proved by history and the map of the world. A nation among whose children alone are found all that man has known as great by genius, virtue, science, and courage. Whole legions of doctors, virgins, martyrs, orators, poets, philosophers, and artists, the great legislators, good kings, and illustrious warriors in every part of the world. A nation so much the more aristocratic that to her all others owe their superiority. No matter what may be said or done, history points this out as the great Catholic nation. I belong to it. The sign of the cross is its escutcheon, and shall I be ashamed of it? God himself has deigned to show by striking miracles how honored in his sight are the person and the member that make the sign of the cross. Saint Editha, daughter of Edgar, King of England, from her very infancy bore the sign of the cross in her heart. This little princess, one of the most beautiful flowers of virginity that have adorned the former Isle of Saints, did nothing without first making this salutary sign on her forehead and breast. Having caused a church to be built in honor of Saint Dionysius, she begged Saint Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, to come to dedicate it. He did so willingly, and in several interviews which he had with the saint, he was struck at seeing her make so frequently the sign of the cross on her forehead with the thumb, according to the custom of the early Christians. This devotion pleased him so much that he begged God to bless that thumb, and even to preserve it from the corruption of the grave. His prayer was granted. The saint died soon after, at the age of 23 years, and, appearing to the holy bishop, said, "Raise my body from the tomb, you will find it incorrupt, with the exception of those members, of which, in the levity of my childhood, I made a bad use." Those members were her eyes, feet, and hands, which in effect were found to be decayed, except the thumb, with which she had so often made the sign of the cross. As regards the point of honor, were our ancestors wrong in making such frequent use of the sign of the cross? Are we right in not making it? Alas! Far different from ours was the pride of their nobility, the feeling of their dignity. By dwelling so much on the obligations of that dignity, I do not wonder at their having established a society, which, for the heroism of its virtues, is without parallel in the annals of the world. You will now begin to understand it. The first sentiment that the sign of the cross inspires us with is respect for ourselves, because it ennobles us. Respect for ourselves. Dear friend, what a great thing I have said! I look around me, I see an age, a world, a rising generation which talks incessantly of the dignity of man, of emancipation, of liberty. These words, either void of meaning or filled with an evil one, render the age, the world, the generation, ungovernable. Impatient of the yoke of all authority, divine, social, civil, or parental, they continually cry out to all they meet, "Respect me!" Very good, but if you wish to be respected, begin by respecting yourself. The respect of others for us is proportional to that which we have for ourselves. Cruelty, hypocrisy, debauchery, vice gilded, gloved, painted, plumed, spurred, and crowned, may inspire fear, but can never win respect. Now then, the man of the day, whether he be old or young, who does not make the sign of the cross, does he respect himself? Let us make a trial by autopsy. The noblest part of man is the soul. The noblest faculty of his soul is the intelligence. Precious vessel, formed by the hand of God Himself to receive truth, and nothing but the truth. All that is not truth defiles and profanes it. Does the man of our day respect it? Is it truth that he deposits therein? He has nothing but disgust for the pure sources whence it flows. Divine oracles, sermons, books of asceticism or Christian philosophy fill him with loathing. If you descend into that baptized intelligence, you will find yourself to be in a storehouse of odds and ends. There you find jumbled together, pell-mell, ignorance, idle tales, frivolity, prejudices, lies, errors, doubts, objections, denial, impieties, silliness, and trifles. A sad spectacle, which reminds me of an ostrich that died lately in Lyons. You know that in the autopsy, one of the stomachs of the stupid animal was found to be a regular storehouse of old iron, ends of ropes, and pieces of wood. Such is the intellectual nourishment of the man who does not make the sign of the cross. Behold how he respects it! And his heart? Excuse me, my dear Frederick, from revealing to you its ignominy. Its emotions, instead of being directed upward, tend downward. Instead of soaring like the eagle, it crawls like the worm. Instead of feeding like the bee on the perfumed juice of flowers, like the stercorary fly it rests only on filth. There is no violation of the immaculate law from which it recoils, no pollution which it avoids, and, as you know that from the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, the throat is, like the vent-hole of a sepulchre, full of corruption. And his body? Young man, who think it beneath you to make the sign of the cross, you believe yourself very clever. You are to be pitied. You think yourself independent. You are a slave. You refuse to honor yourself by doing what the elite of mankind do. By a just judgment, you shall dishonor yourself by the most shameful acts of the dregs of humanity. Your hand will not trace the divine sign on your forehead, but it will touch what it should not touch. You will not defend your eyes, lips, or breast with this protecting sign. Your eyes shall be sullied by looking at what they should never see. Your lips, talkative yet dumb, loquaces muti, as says a great genius, shall say nothing that they should, and everything they should not. Your breast, a profane altar, shall burn with a fire the very name of which is a disgrace. This is private history. You cannot deny it. You cannot efface it. Written here in ink, it may be read on every part of your being, written in the blood of sin, in sanguine peccati. And his life? The man who does not make, or who has ceased to make the sign of the cross, loses all esteem of his life. He despises it, he squanders it, for he never takes it in earnest. To turn night into day and day into night, to work little, sleep much, fare sumptuously, to refuse nothing to his appetites, to spend time without any regard to eternity, that is to say, in weaving cobwebs, catching flies, and building card castles, in a word, using his life as if he were the proprietor of it, this is not taking life in earnest. To take life in earnest is to use it according to the will of Him who gave it to us, and who will demand a rigorous account of it, not as a whole, but in detail, not by the year, but by the moment. When the despiser of the divine sign, which would ennoble his life by inspiring him with the respect for his soul and body, is wearied with the ways of trifling and iniquity, what does he do? Alas! He but too often throws down life as an insupportable burden. regarding himself as a beast, for which there is neither fear nor hope beyond the grave, he kills himself. Here, my good Frederick, how can I express my sorrow? That which the Apostle, ravaged with admiration, said of the marvels of heaven, that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive, we must now say with fear, shame, and trembling. No, at no epoch, in no climate, among no nation, not even pagans or cannibals, has man ever seen or heard, or his mind conceived, what we see, hear, and touch with our hands. What is it? Suicide. Suicide on a scale without example in history. In France alone, 100,000 within the last 30 years. 100,000, and they continue still to increase. Now, I am almost certain, without having the proof, that of those 100,000 persons who died in despair, more than 99,000 had lost the custom of making the sign of the cross frequently, seriously, and religiously. Hold this for the 13th article of your creed. More tomorrow. End of letter 5. Chapter 6 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by GAUME. Letter 6. Continuation of the preceding letter. The Sign of the Cross is a book which instructs us. Creation, redemption, glorification. 3 words which contain all the science of God, of man, and of the world. The Sign of the Cross says these 3 words with authority, with clearness, with sublimity. It says them to everyone, everywhere, and always. December 1st. A divine sign, the distinctive mark of the elite of humanity, the escutcheon of the Catholic. Such, my dear Frederick, is the sign of the cross, considered in its first point of view. If it be true that rank imposes obligation, I know of no means more simple, easy, and efficacious to inspire men with sentiments of dignity and respect for themselves than the sign of the cross made frequently, seriously, and religiously. This is one of the reasons of its being. This sign, says a father of the Church, is a powerful protection. It is gratuitous because of the poor, easy because of the weak, a benefit from God, the standard of the faithful, the terror of demons. Far from causing you to despise it, its being a free gift should even increase your gratitude. I add that its eloquence is equal to its power. What does it say to man? We shall see. We are ignorant. The Sign of the Cross is a book which instructs us. Creation, redemption, glorification, all science, theological, philosophical, social, political, historical, divine, and human, is comprised in these 3 words. The science of the past, present, and future is here and here only. These 3 words are the lights of the world, the basis of intelligence. Suppose for a moment that the world forgets them, or loses their sense. What does it become? An agglomeration of atoms, moving in empty space, without direction or aim. It becomes blind without guide or staff. An inexplicable mystery to itself, unhappy without consolation, a galley slave without hope. Behold man, behold society. These 3 words, creation, redemption, glorification, are, then, more necessary to the human race than the bread which nourishes it or the air that it breathes. They are necessary to everyone, at every hour and always. They alone direct a life and every life, an action and every action, a word and every word, a thought and every thought, a joy and every joy, a sadness and every sadness, a sentiment and every sentiment. This supposed, reason says that God owed it to himself to establish a means, universal, easy, and permanent, by which to give to all that fundamental knowledge, to give it not once and for a time only, but to renew it unceasingly as he renews, at every instant, the air which we breathe. To what doctor shall be given the charge of this indispensable teaching? To St. Paul, St. Augustine, St. Thomas, or any other great genius of the East or the West? No, those doctors die, and we must have one that is immortal. Those doctors dwell in a certain place, and we must have one that lives everywhere. They speak a language that cannot be understood by all. We must have one who speaks intelligibly to everyone, to the savage inhabitants of Oceanica, as well as to the civilized inhabitants of the Old World. Who then shall be our teacher? You know it. It is the sign of the cross. It, and it only, fulfills all the requisite conditions. It never dies. It dwells everywhere. Its language is universal. In an instant it gives its lesson. In an instant everyone can understand it. In proof of what I assert, allow me, dear friend, to discover a mystery to you. The incarnate Word, whom Isaias with reason calls the teacher of mankind, had resolved to die for us. Many kinds of death were presented to him: stoning, decapitation, poison, being thrown from a high place, fire, water, and what not. Amongst all these, why did he choose the cross? A learned theologian answered this question many centuries ago. One of the reasons why infinite wisdom has chosen the cross is because a slight motion of the hand is sufficient to trace upon us the instrument of the divine torture, bright and powerful sign which teaches us all that we have to know and serves as a buckler against our enemies. Behold the sign of the cross duly established as the catechist of mankind. Is it true, you ask, that it performs its functions well? In other words, that it repeats, and repeats in a becoming manner, the three great words, creation, redemption, glorification? Not only does it repeat them, but it explains them with an authority, sublimity, and clearness which belong to it alone. With authority, divine in its origin, it is the organ of God Himself. With sublimity and clearness, this you shall see presently. When you place your hand on your forehead while saying, "In the name," using only the singular number, the sign of the cross teaches you the indivisible unity of the divine essence. By this word alone, be you a child or maidservant, you know more than all the philosophers of paganism. What progress in a single momentary act! In saying, "of the Father," what a new and immense ray of light in your intellect! The sign of the cross has told you that there is a being, the Father of all fathers, the eternal principle of being, from whom proceed all creatures, celestial and terrestrial, visible and invisible. At this new word are dissipated the thick mists which during 20 centuries concealed from the eyes of the pagan world the origin of all things. You continue to say, "and of the Son." The adorable sign also continues its teaching. It tells you that the Father of all fathers has a Son like Himself. While making you carry your hand to your breast, when you pronounce His name, it teaches you that this eternal Son of God became in time the Son of Man in the womb of a virgin in order to redeem man. Man is then fallen. What brilliant light does this third word cause to rise upon your intellect? The coexistence of good and evil on the earth, the terrible duality which you feel within yourself, that mixture of noble instincts and base propensities, of sublime actions and shameful ones, the necessity of struggling, the possibility and means of rehabilitation, all those mysteries whose depth so long puzzled and perplexed the pagan philosophers, are no longer veiled from you. You conclude by saying, "and of the Holy Ghost." This word completes the teachings of the sign of the cross. Thanks to it, you know that there is in God unity of essence and trinity of persons. You have a just idea of the being by excellence, the complete being. He would not be such, were He not one and three. If the first person is necessarily power, the second necessarily wisdom, the third is necessarily love. This love, essentially beneficent, completes the work of the Father who creates, and of the Son who redeems. He sanctifies man and conducts him to glory. What clear teaching for the direction of the life of nations and individuals, for kings as well as for subjects! If Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, or any of the other ancient seekers after truth, those philosophers, legislators, and moralists, exhausted by study and tormented by insolvable doubts, had heard of a master who taught with the depth and sublimity of the Sign of the Cross, we may hold it as certain that they would have gone to the uttermost end of the world to see him, happy to spend their lives in listening to him. In pronouncing the name of the Holy Ghost, you have formed the cross. You know not only the Redeemer, but the instrument of redemption. Thus, while the Sign of the Cross inundates the mind with dazzling lights, it also opens in the heart an inexhaustible source of love, a new benefit, of which I shall speak hereafter. In the meantime, answer me, is it possible to teach in fewer words, with greater eloquence, and in more intelligible language, the three great dogmas of creation, redemption, and glorification, the pivots of the moral world, the generating principles of the human intellect? A being created, a being destined for eternal glory, a being redeemed. Man, behold what you are. What do you think of this, dear friend? Is not this theology? But if theology is the science of God, of man, and of the world, if philosophy, the rational knowledge of God, of man, and of the world, is the daughter of theology, if from theology and philosophy flow all sciences, politics, ethics, and history, it follows from this, that the Sign of the Cross is the most learned and the least diffused doctor that has ever taught. Do you wish to know what place it holds in the world? I will tell you tomorrow. End of letter 6.
Chapter 7 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Portelli. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by John GAUME. 7th letter. The place which the Sign of the Cross holds in the world, what the human race was before it knew how to make the Sign of the Cross, what becomes of the world when it ceases to make it. Another point of view. The Sign of the Cross is a treasure which enriches us. December 2nd. Dear friend, they who despise or contemn the Sign of the Cross have very little suspicion of the place it holds in the world. They belong to that class of persons, so numerous in our day, who suspect nothing, because they doubt nothing. Lay aside for a moment your office of judge. Give me your hand. Let us make a brief tour through the ancient and modern worlds. Let us visit first the brilliant ages of antiquity, in which men knew not how to make the sign of the cross, and pilgrims of truth, let us travel through the east and the west. Memphis, Athens, Rome, three great centers of light, call us to the schools of their wise men. What say those illustrious masters on the points most important for us to know? Is the world eternal, or has it been created? If created, by whom was it created? Is the author of nature matter or spirit? Is he eternal, free, independent? Are there many? Answer: hesitation, uncertainty, flagrant contradictions. What is good? What is evil? What their origin? How comes it that they are found in man and in the world? Is there a remedy for evil, or is it incurable? What is the remedy? Who possesses it? How can we obtain it? How apply it? Answer: hesitation, uncertainty, flagrant contradictions. What is man? Has he a soul? Of what nature is that soul? Is it a fire, a breath, a spirit, aeriform matter? Is it subject to fate? If it survives the body, what is its destiny? What is the end of its existence? To all these questions, and to 1,000 others, the answer is hesitation, uncertainty, flagrant contradictions. Ah, pretended great men and great nations, who cannot give the first word of answer to these fundamental questions. You are but great ignoramuses. What matters it to us that you can invent systems, sharpen sophisms, overwhelm the schools, the Senate, and the Areopagus with your inexhaustible eloquence, drive chariots in the circus, build cities, join in battles, conquer provinces, make earth and sea tributary to your concupiscence? As long as you are ignorant of what you are, whence you came, and whither you are going, you are to use the expression of one of your own, but fattened swine of the herds of Epicurus, Epicuri de grege porci. Such was the world before the sign of the cross. But this eloquent sign has appeared. All those disgraceful darknesses have been dissipated. By making it, man, whether learned or illiterate, has learned the science of himself, of the world, and of God. By repeating it unceasingly, he has engraven it in the very depths of his soul, in such a manner that he can never forget it. Whatever people may say, it was owing to the frequent use of the sign of the cross, in all classes of society, in the city as well as in the country, that the Catholic world of the primitive and Middle Ages preserved in a degree unknown either before or since the divine science, the mother of all others, and the light of life. Could it be otherwise? Let a man during 40 years repeat seriously 10 times a day any error, whatever it may be, he will end by being completely imbued and identified with it. Why should not the same happen with the truth? Do you desire the proof of what I advance? Let us continue our journey. Come with me through the modern world. It has abandoned the sign of the cross. Hence it no longer has a monitor ever at its side to repeat at every instant those 3 great dogmas so necessary to its moral life. It forgets them. They are for it as if they were not. Now see what becomes of it with regard to science. Like the ancient world, you hear it stammer shamefully over the very elementary principles of religion, of right, of the family, and of propriety. What grounds of truth maintain its conversations? What are contained in its books of politics and philosophy? By the glimmer of what light does it direct its private life? And the newspapers, those new fathers of the Church, what do you think of them? Among the torrent of words which they every day pour out on society, how many sound ideas regarding God, man, or the world do you find? What does it know, this modern world, this age of enlightenment, which knows no longer how to make the sign of the cross? Neither more nor less than the pagans, its masters and models. The God of self, the God of commerce, the God of cotton, the God of the dollar, the God of the belly, Deus Venter. It knows and adores the goddess of industry, the goddess of steam, the goddess of electricity. As means to satisfy its cupidity, it knows and adores the science of matter, chemistry, physic, mechanism, dynamics, salts, essences, sulfates, nitrates, and carbonates. Behold its gods, its worship, its theology, its philosophy, its politics, its morals, its life. Yet a little more improvement, and it will know as much as the contemporaries of Noah, condemned to perish by waters of the deluge. For them also, all science consisted in knowing and adoring the gods of the modern world, in drinking, eating, building, buying, selling, marrying, and being married. Man had concentrated his life in matter. He had become flesh, ignorant as flesh, foul as flesh. Of all those inclinations, which is wanting to the world of our day, although less advanced than that of the giants, is it not of the same nature? As for the rest, nothing better can be expected from it. Knowing no longer how to make the sign of the cross, or refusing to make it, it materializes itself, and in virtue of the law of moral gravitation, falls back into the state in which it was before it knew how to make it. We are ignorant. The sign of the cross is a book which instructs us. From this new point of view, you can judge whether our forefathers were wrong in making it incessantly. That the deplorable ignorance of the present world may in a great measure be ascribed to its abandonment of the sign of the cross, you shall presently see. What is ignorance? Ignorance is poverty of the mind. In matters of religion, it is more frequently called poverty of the heart. Poverty of the heart comes from its weakness in practicing virtue and rejecting evil. Why this weakness? Because man neglects the means of obtaining grace, or rendering it efficacious. The first, the most familiar, prompt, and easy of those means is, as you know, prayer. Of all prayers, the easiest, shortest, most familiar, and perhaps the most powerful is the sign of the cross. A new meditation for you, a new justification for the early Christians. We are poor. The sign of the cross is a treasure that enriches us. A beggar is one who goes daily from door to door to beg his bread. Croesus was a beggar. Alexander was a beggar. Caesar was a beggar. All emperors and kings, all empresses and queens were beggars. Crowned beggars indeed, but always beggars. Who is the man, no matter how opulent we may suppose him to be, who is not obliged to say every day at the door of the great father of the family, "Give us this day our daily bread"? Can the most potent monarch make a grain of wheat? Man has received everything, physical and moral life, and the means of preserving both quid habes quod non accepisti. He possesses nothing of his own, not even one hair of his head. Again, what he has received has not been given him once for all. He is in want every day, every hour, every instant. If God, the giver of all, were to withhold his gifts for a moment, man should die. Since then, man has nothing, and is in want of everything. At every instant he must beg. From this, my dear Frederick, arises a great law of the moral world, on which most certainly your young companions have never reflected. I mean the law of prayer. The pagans of the ancient world, the idolaters and savages of the present day, have lost more or less of the patrimony of traditionary truths, but none have lost their knowledge of the law of prayer. Man, from his first appearance on the globe, has invariably observed it under one form or another. Stronger than all passions, more eloquent than all sophisms, the instinct of self-preservation told him that on his invariable fidelity to it depended his existence. It did not deceive him. On that day on which no prayer, either human or angelic, would be raised to God, all relations would cease between the Creator and the creature, between the giver and the beggar, and the flow of the river of life would at that instant be suspended. Is it not this the profound mystery revealed to the world by the incarnate Word himself, when he said that we ought always to pray, and not to faint? Apportet semper orare, et nunquam difficere. Take notice how imperative are these words. The lawgiver does not invite, he commands, and the commandment is of absolute necessity. Apportet. He allows of no intermission, either day or night, in the accomplishment of the law. Apportet semper. As long as man shall be a beggar in the sight of God, so long shall the law of prayer never be modified, never recalled, never suspended. And as man must always be a mendicant, it follows that the law of prayer shall preserve its empire unto the last day of the world, et nunquam difficere. The physical world itself has been organized with reference to the perpetual observance of this conserving law of the moral world. Thanks to the successive passage of the sun over one hemisphere or the other, one half of mankind are always awake for prayer. Now, one of the most powerful prayers is the sign of the cross. All mankind have believed this. They believed it only because they had learned it. They could have learned it only from God himself, from whom they have learned everything. I say all mankind, designedly. Your young companions believe, perhaps, that the sign of the cross dates from Christianity, or that at least its use has been limited to the Jews and Catholics. In my letter, I will show you what confidence this opinion deserves. End of Letter 7. Recording by Michael Portelli. Chapter 8 of the Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Portelli. The Sign of the Cross in the 19th Century by John GAUME. Letter 8. The sign of the cross, known and practiced since the beginning of the world. Contradictions only apparent. 7 ways of making the sign of the cross. Testimonies of the fathers, David, Solomon, and all the Jewish nation, made the sign of the cross and knew its value. Proofs. December 3rd. My dear Frederick, your ears and those of many others will tingle at the first sentence of my letter. The sign of the cross runs back to the very beginning of the world. It has been made by all nations, even by pagans in their solemn prayers on important occasions when they desired to obtain some signal favours. Let me first remark that between this proposition and that which I advanced in my preceding letter, there is no contradiction. Yesterday I spoke of the sign of the cross in its perfect form and fully understood, such as we practice it since the Gospel. Today I speak of the sign of the cross in a form, elementary though real, and more or less mysterious to those who made it before the Gospel. An explanation seems to be necessary. I am about to give it. The sign of the cross is so natural to man that at no epoch, among no nation, and in no form of worship, did man ever put himself in communication with God by prayer without making the sign of the cross. Do you know of any nation who were accustomed to pray with their arms hanging down? As for me, I do not. All those that I know, and I know the Jews, the pagans, and the Catholics, have in prayer made the sign of the cross. There are 7 ways of making it. With the arms extended, man then becomes an entire sign of the cross. With hands clasped, the fingers interlaced, thus forming 5 signs of the cross. The hands joined, one against the other, the thumbs placed one over the other, again the sign of the cross. The hands crossed on the breast, another form of the sign of the cross. The arms equally crossed on the breast, 5th way of making it. The thumb of the right hand passing under the index finger and resting on the middle one, a sign of the cross much in use, as we shall see hereafter. And finally the right hand passing from the forehead to the breast, and from the breast to the shoulders, a more explicit form which you know. Under one or other of these forms, the sign of the cross has been practiced everywhere and always, in solemn circumstances, with a knowledge more or less clear of its efficacy. Jacob lies at the point of death. Around him stands his 12 sons, the future fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Inspired by God, the Holy Patriarch announces to each what shall happen to him in succeeding ages. At the sight of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two children, the old man, being moved, invokes on them all the blessings of heaven. To obtain them, what does he do? He crosses his arms, says the Scripture, and places his left hand on the child at his right, and his right on the one at his left. Behold, the sign of the cross, the eternal token of benediction. In this, tradition is not deceived. Jacob was the type of the Messiah. In that solemn moment, words, attitude, everything in the patriarch was prophetic. Jacob, says St. John of Damascus, in crossing his hands to bless Joseph's children, forms the sign of the cross. Nothing is more evident. Even from apostolic times, Tertullian established the same fact and gave it the like meaning. The Old Testament, says he, shows us Jacob blessing Joseph's children, his left hand passed over on the head of him at his right, and the right on the head of him at his left. In this position they formed the sign of the cross, and foretold the blessings of which the crucified should be the source. Let us go back to the time of the servitude in Egypt, and pass on to Moses. Having reached the midst of the desert, the Hebrews find themselves face to face with Amalek. At the head of a powerful army, the hostile king stops their passage. A decisive battle is inevitable. What will Moses do? Instead of remaining in the plain, to encourage by his voice and gesture the battalions of Israel, he ascends the mountain which commands a view of the battlefield. What does the lawgiver, inspired by God, do during the combat? He makes the sign of the cross. Nothing but the sign of the cross, and the sign of the cross during the whole of the combat. Nowhere do we learn that he pronounces any words. With hands open and arms extended toward heaven, he makes himself a living sign of the cross. God sees him in this attitude, and the victory is gained. This is not an idle supposition. Listen again to the fathers of the Church. Amalek, cries out St. John of Damascus, those hands extended in the form of a cross have vanquished thee. And the great Tertullian, why does Moses, at the time that Joshua is about to combat with Amalek, do what he never did before? Pray with extended arms. In a circumstance so decisive, should he not, in order to render his prayer more efficacious, bend his knee, strike his breast, and bow his head to the dust? Nothing of all this. Why? Because that combat of the Lord in which Amalek was delivered up a prey prefigured the battles of the incarnate Word against Satan and the sign of the cross by which he was to conquer. And Saint Justin, the philosopher and martyr, who lived so near the time of the apostles, says Moses with extended arms, upheld by Hur and Aaron, remaining on the mountain until sunset, what is he but a living sign of the cross? Insensible to the miracles of the paternal solicitude, of which they were the constant objects, the Hebrews murmur against Moses and against God. Murmurs rise to revolt, and the revolt becomes general and obstinate. The chastisement is not long delayed, and it assumes the same characteristics. Royal serpents, frightful reptiles, whose venom burns like fire, fall upon the guilty and wound them with their fangs. The camp is filled with the dead and dying. At the prayer of Moses, God shows them mercy, to put the serpents to flight and heal the innumerable sick. What means will he indicate? Prayers? No. Fasts? No. An altar? An expiatory column? Nothing of all this. He orders him to make a sign of the cross, permanent and visible to all, a sign that each of the sick shall make in his heart, only by looking at it. And such shall be the power of this sign, that one look alone shall suffice to restore him to health. The signification of this divinely commanded sign is not doubtful. the true sign of the cross, the eternally living sign of the cross, our Lord himself, has revealed to mankind that the sign of the desert was a figure of himself. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him may not perish, but may have everlasting life. If the limits of a letter permitted, we might read together the annals of this typical people, and you would see, my dear friend, that on all important occasions, the only ones which we know well, they had recourse to the sign of the cross. I will cite a few of them. In the sacrifices, the priest first raised the victim in the manner prescribed by law. He then carried it from east to west, as we learn from the Jews themselves. Thus was made the sign of the cross. It was by the same motion that the high priest and even the simple priests blessed the people after the sacrifice. From the Jewish church, this sign passed to the Christian. The first faithful, struck by the ancient manner of blessing with the sign of the cross, were easily instructed by the apostles on its mysterious signification, and naturally inclined to continue it, adding the divine words which explain it. In the time of the prophet Ezekiel, the abominations of Jerusalem were at their height. A mysterious personage, says the prophet, received orders to traverse the city, and to mark the sign T on the foreheads of all those who mourned over the abominations of that guilty capital. By his side walked 6 other persons, each armed with a deadly weapon, who were commanded to kill indiscriminately all those not marked with the salutary sign. How is it possible not to see here a striking figure of the sign of the cross, which is made on our foreheads? Thus it is understood by the fathers of the Church, among others, by Tertullian and St. Jerome, as, say they, the sign that marked on the foreheads of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who grieved over the crimes of that city, protected them against the exterminating angel, so also the sign of the cross marked on the forehead of a man is an assurance that he shall not become the victim of the demon and the other enemies of his salvation, if he really grieve over the abomination which this sign interdicts. The Philistines have reduced the Israelites to the most humiliating servitude. Samson begins their deliverance, but unhappily the strength of Israel allows himself to be surprised. They load him with chains. After having caused his eyes to be pulled out, they make a plaything of him to amuse them at their feasts. Samson, however, meditates revenge. He plans how with one blow he may be able to destroy thousands of enemies. Providence has so arranged things that it is by the sign of the cross he shall consummate his design. Placed between 2 of the pillars that support the edifice, says St. Augustine, the strength of Israel extends his arms in the form of a cross. In this all-powerful attitude he shakes the pillars. They give way, he crushes his enemies, and like the great crucified, of whom he is the figure, he dies, buried in his own triumph. David, overwhelmed with sorrow, is reduced to the greatest extremity in which a king can find himself. A parricidical son, revolting subjects, an unsteady throne, old age fast coming on. What does the inspired monarch do? He prays by making the sign of the cross. Solomon finishes the temple of Jerusalem. The magnificent edifice is consecrated with a pomp worthy of the monarch. He wishes to draw down the blessings of heaven upon the new dwelling of the God of Israel, and to obtain his favours for those who will come there to pray. What does Solomon do? He prays by making the sign of the cross. And Solomon, says the sacred text, stood before the altar of the Lord, in the sight of the assembly of Israel, and spread forth his hands toward heaven, and said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like thee in heaven above or on earth beneath. have regard to the prayer of thy servant, that thy eyes may be opened on this house night and day, that thou mayest hearken to the supplication of thy servant and of thy people Israel. To believe that the patriarchs, judges, and prophets, the kings and the seers of Israel, were the only ones who knew and practiced the sign of the cross would be an error. All the people knew it, and in times of public danger made religious use of it. Sennacherib is advancing from victory to victory. The greater part of Palestine is invaded. Jerusalem itself is threatened. Behold, what that entire nation, men, women, and children, do to repulse the enemy. Like Moses, they make the sign of the cross, become living images of that holy sign. And they invoked the Lord of mercies, and spreading their hands, they lifted them up to heaven, and the Lord quickly heard them. Another danger threatens them. Heliodorus, with a numerous band of soldiers, comes to pillage the temple. He has already entered the exterior enclosure. Yet a few moments and the sacrilege shall be consummated. The priests lie prostrate at the foot of the altar, but nothing stops the spoliator. What do the people do? They have recourse to their traditional weapon. They pray, making the sign of the cross. You know the rest. If it is contestable that to pray with outstretched arms is one form of the sign of the cross, you see that from all antiquity the Jews have known and practiced it, with a mysterious instinctive feeling of its power. We shall see tomorrow if the pagans were much less instructed. End of Letter 8. Recording by Michael Portelli.